I want to start with a quote, one that really sets the stage. It's from President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman's inaugural address back in 1951.
Right.
He promised to convert Guatemala from a backward country with a predominantly feudal economy into a modern capitalist state. And then he adds the most important part, doing it in a way that raises the standard of living of the great majority and settles the enormous debt the dominant class owes to the people.
And that language is so critical. He's not talking about communism.
Not at all. He's talking about economic independence, about basic fairness. So in this deep dive, our mission is to unpack the source material and figure out how that vision, well, how it led to a 36-year civil war, devastating violence, and, massive external intervention.
To really get it, you have to look at the context in Guatemala at the time. I mean, like a lot of Central America, you had authoritarian military rule, a tiny land-owning elite. Yeah. But the sources point out two huge differences. One, the U.S. played a really kinetic role starting in 1954. And two, the population is majority indigenous Maya, who were historically crushed by the ruling class, the Ladinos.
So the conflict was simmering for a long, long time. Guatemala gets independence from Spain in 1847. But that didn't bring any real change for most people.
No.
Between 1871 and 1940, you have these liberal governments that modernize infrastructure, but it's all for one thing.
Coffee.
Coffee. It was all about getting the coffee out of the country as efficiently as possible.
And that dependency was just extreme. By 1900, our sources say something like 85% of all of Guatemala's exports were coffee.
85%.
Yeah. And that means the coffee elite had total control. I mean, politically, socially, economically. They enforced forced labor, our sources call it virtual slavery, and they just took land from indigenous communities.
And right at the peak of all this, a new power player arrives. It's not a country, but a company, the United Fruit Company, the UFC.
The UFC, formed in 1899, it basically became this economic octopus across Central America. The Guatemalan government just handed them huge amounts of land.
Millions of acres, right?
Millions. And crucially, they also gave them control over the railways and the ports. So the UFC could get its bananas out and, basically muscle out any local competition. They dominated the economy for decades.
But this entire system, this whole house of cards built on just coffee and bananas, was incredibly vulnerable. And then, 1929.
The Wall Street crash.
Yeah.
And the Great Depression that followed, it just shattered everything. Commodity prices collapsed. There was widespread despair. And globally, this is when you see the rise of strongmen.
And that global trend hits Guatemala in 1931 with the election of Jorge Ubico Castañeda.
Right, who immediately becomes a dictator. He's backed by the landowners. He's backed by U.S. business interests. And he rules with an iron fist until 1944. But eventually, the pressure builds and democratic elections are held.
And the first guy, Juan Jose Arevalo, he tries some mild reforms. Social security, public health, education.
Basic stuff, really.
Right. Yeah, but even he knew not to touch the third rail of Guatemalan politics. Land redistribution. The elites would never, ever allow it.
Which is exactly why the election of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman in 1950 was such a turning point. Because he was the one who wasn't afraid to touch it.
His big policy was the 1952 agrarian reform, and it's important to understand what this was and what it wasn't.
Yes, this wasn't a socialist land grab. It was very specifically designed to redistribute uncultivated land.
Land that was just sitting there unused.
Exactly. Land that was sitting fallow, and give it to about 100,000 landless peasants. And the main target was, of course, the United Fruit Company.
Which terrified them and the whole landowning class.
Of course. The UFC owned almost 3 million acres, and Arbenz wanted to nationalize about half of that, the parts they weren't even using. But here's the genius of it.
The compensation.
The compensation. He offered them about $1 million. But that figure was based on the company's own declared tax value for the land.
Wait, okay, hold on. So he was basically saying, we'll pay you exactly what you've been telling us this land is worth for years to avoid paying taxes.
Precisely. It was a brilliant political trap. Of course, the UFC had been lowballing its value for decades. So they were furious. They demanded $16 million instead.
That brings us to Washington, because this is where the U.S. government's motives get, let's just say they get very personal.
It's pretty jaw-dropping, actually. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, his old law firm represented the United Fruit Company.
And his brother.
His brother, Alan Dulles, was the director of the CIA. And he was a former USV board member and a shareholder.
So this wasn't just about ideology, it was about money. It was personal.
Absolutely. The UFC launched this huge propaganda campaign to paint Arbenz as a communist threat, and it worked because it fit the Cold War paranoia perfectly.
But was he a communist?
The sources are pretty clear. He was friendly with the Guatemalan Communist Party, sure, but they were a tiny Democratic party. I think they had 4 seats in the legislature.
Horsey.
Yeah. They were no threat to the U.S., but the communist label was all the Eisenhower administration needed to hear.
So he authorizes the CIA plan, Operation PB's success.
In 1954. And the actual invasion force was tiny. The CIA got some right-wing officers together, armed about 100 guys in Honduras, and sent them across the border.
100 men. How could that possibly work?
It wasn't about the soldiers. It was all psychological warfare. They had a pirate radio station broadcasting propaganda. They dropped leaflets from planes. They made it seem like a massive army was coming.
So they created panic.
Total panic. The loyal Guatemalan forces thought resistance was hopeless, and Arbenz, he resigned to avoid a civil war, a bloodbath. And just like that, the democratically elected government was gone.
The backlash across Latin America was huge, but it was too late. The new CIA-backed leader, Colonel Castillo Armas, took over, and the consequences were immediate, and they were brutal.
That's putting it mildly. The new regime unleashed this massive wave of persecution. Vigilante groups, the army, the police, they went after anyone tied to Arbenz's reforms. Union leaders, peasant organizers.
And Castillo Armas created a list.
A list of 72,000 names. People to be persecuted or imprisoned. It was a systematic effort to wipe out all opposition.
Before we get into the long war that followed, there's this incredible little detail in the sources, a footnote of history.
Che Guevara.
Ernesto Che Guevara. He was in Guatemala at the time, just as a young doctor and adventurer. And watching the U.S. overthrow a reformist government just to protect corporate profits, that was the moment for him.
It's what radicalized him. It completely shaped his worldview on American imperialism. He fled to the Argentine embassy, then to Mexico, and that's where he meets Fidel Castro. The rest is history.
So the coup in Guatemala didn't just destabilize one country. It helped create the most famous revolutionary of the 20th century.
It really did. And that revolutionary spark, inspired by Cuba, started to catch on in Guatemala itself in the 1960s. Rebel groups started to form, like the FAR and the MR-13.
And the government's response was violent.
Immediate and violent. In 1966, they launched Operation Cleanup, which is just a code name for raids, torture, assassinations, and critically scorched earth tactics against indigenous villages they thought were supporting the rebels.
They managed to scatter the insurgents for a while, but by the 1970s, the pressure was building again. The military regime wouldn't allow any real democratic reform.
And you had new economic problems. The OPEC oil crisis caused a global recession. Then a massive earthquake hit in 1976. All this despair just pushed more and more poor peasants into the arms of the opposition.
And that's when we get to the 1980s. And the violence shifts from being, a counterinsurgency to something else entirely.
It becomes systematic. Amnesty International put out a report in 1981 calling it a government campaign of political assassinations.
And then in 1982, the Catholic bishops of Guatemala themselves say that the killing has reached a scale that
it falls into the category of genocide against the Maya people. They call it what it was. This was the targeted extermination of an entire ethnic group.
And this is happening just as General Efrain Rios Montt takes power in a coup. He was a U.S. ally, a graduate of the School of the Americas, and a favorite of the Reagan administration.
And under his 17-month rule, the numbers are just staggering. The sources say there were about 800 murders or disappearances every single month.
800 a month?
It was institutionalized terror. And the Reagan administration's role here is, well, it's critical. They publicly denied the genocide was even happening. They praised Rios Montt, called him a man of great integrity.
Which gave him the political cover he needed.
It gave him a green light. It enabled his campaign to just flatten indigenous villages. The military's logic was that the Maya people themselves were the social base for the guerrillas, so the people had to be eliminated.
Rios Montt is eventually overthrown in 1983, and there are democratic elections again in 85.
Sure.
But the civilian government is basically powerless to stop the military. The war just grinds on.
What finally changes things isn't internal reform, it's global politics.
The Cold War ends.
Exactly. The Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union collapses. Suddenly, the U.S. has no geopolitical reason to keep funding these anti-communist military regimes in Central America. The money and the support dry up.
And that creates the opening for peace. Negotiations start, and on December 29th, 1996, the final peace accord is signed. 36 years of conflict were over.
So what was the final toll? A historical clarification commission was formed, and its findings in 1999 are just heartbreaking.
200,000 dead.
Around 200,000 dead or disappeared. And of the victims they could identify, 83% were indigenous Maya.
And who was responsible?
The commission was unequivocal. It found that government forces and their paramilitary groups were responsible for 93% of the documented human rights violations. This was a war of the state against its own people.
But then something remarkable happened. Guatemala became the first country in Latin America to try a former head of state for genocide in its own national court.
Right. In May 2013, Rios Montt was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, specifically for ordering the murder of over 1,700 Maya Ixil people. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. It was a huge moment for justice.
But it didn't last.
No. Just 10 days later, the country's highest court, citing a procedural error, annulled the entire verdict.
So the conviction was overturned on a technicality.
Exactly. It just showed how much power the old military elite still had. A new trial was ordered, but it never really finished before Rios Montt died. So you have this historic conviction, followed by a frustrating, unresolved ending.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, what does it all mean? You have this devastating conflict driven by Cold War ideology that only loses its geopolitical meaning when the Berlin Wall falls.
It's just a tragic example of how external powers can take existing, deep-seated inequality and just pour gasoline on it. What started as a real homegrown movement for economic justice got hijacked and turned into a proxy war, and the victims were the people who were already the most marginalized.
It's hard not to go back to that 1951 speech from Arbenz. His goal was to erase that enormous debt owed by the elite to the common people.
Yeah.
And decades later, the Historical Commission finds that this debt was repaid not with land or justice, but with the systematic murder of that same indigenous population. So the question we'll leave you with is this. What happens to the soul of a nation when a debt of justice is repaid with systemic violence instead of reform?